Welcome to The Atypical View. I'm your host, Lauren Florio, a licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in autism, ADHD, and broader neurodiversity. As a fellow neurodivergent mind, I'm here to help us learn and spread awareness on all things mental health, as well as help us unlearn harmful stereotypes by providing psychoeducation rooted in research and lived experience rooted in my atypical view. The Atypical View is obviously this podcast, but it's also my private practice where I provide therapy to clients here in California with me and provide neurodiverse coaching to others worldwide. So, without further ado, let's jump into the Atypical View. Hello and welcome or welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about two diagnoses that are often confused for each other and unsurprisingly misunderstood. We are going to be talking about OCD and OCPD, which I don't think many people know about OCPD. And that's where I think a lot of misunderstanding comes in. Let's just jump into our first segment, which is our psychoeducation segment. OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. It's an anxiety disorder characterized by intrusive, unwanted thoughts that can be obsessions and repetitive behaviors and mental acts, which are the compulsions. And these are performed to alleviate distress. So individuals with OCD often recognize their obsessions and compulsions as irrational, leading to significant anxiety and impairment in daily functioning. And I'll definitely add an element of shame of that lack of control. So in contrast, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, OCPD, is a personality disorder in its name, which is marked by a pervasive pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfection, and control. Unlike OCD, the behaviors and thoughts in OCPD are typically ego-syntonic, which ego means self and syntonic means harmony. So that means that individuals perceive them as appropriate and correct and aligning with their values and core beliefs, even if they might lead to interpersonal difficulties. I think a relevant thing to add is while there is evidence both OCD and OCPD may have genetic predispositions to developing these disorders, there's substantial research that indicates that environmental and developmental factors play a significant role in these disorders manifesting, meaning this isn't something you're born with in the same way that evidence shows we're born with things like autism or ADHD. I've probably said on this podcast before that neurodiversity has a lot of overlapping symptoms within each other, and I think an important one to talk about today is some notable overlap between autism and OCD and OCPD. There are overlapping traits in autism and OCD, like repetitive behaviors and strict routines, whereas we see overlapping traits in autism and OCPD in this perfectionism and rigidity. In both OCPD and OCD and ASD, there's definitely some intense focus on specific interests or tasks. Truthfully, the expression of which symptom is going where is typically depending on, is it regulating from an autistic perspective, is it regulating like sensory overwhelm and like physical distress and overwhelm from social interactions, or is it regulating an internal anxiety due to intrusive thoughts through that OCD perspective, or possibly a need for order with that OCPD perspective? Now, I won't lie to you. I think that there's a good argument that OCPD and autism have a lot in common, but truthfully, I see that OCPD doesn't come with the sensory experience. That's not a part of the criteria, and the social difficulties of not necessarily like you're not good at relationships because you are very rigid, but you're not good at relationships because you struggle to understand the context of relationships, the context of communication. I think those are the very big differences of what's the primary diagnosis, because OCPD doesn't have anything to do with struggling to understand the context of social engagements. Basically, what I'm saying is that it's important to note that while these traits overlap, the underlying motivations and experiences may differ. So, for instance, repetitive behaviors in autism serve as a coping mechanism for sensory processing differences, where, as an OCD, they aim to reduce anxiety related to intrusive thoughts. That's why we don't encourage people diagnosing themselves based off of symptoms, because sometimes the motivation of those symptoms and the core root of those symptoms are what dignifies a different diagnosis. And it can be really challenging sometimes to find the proper diagnosis, even on the clinical side of having the education to do so. Some of these things are very minute differences, and it's important to work with a clinician to be able to identify what your diagnoses are. Let's talk about the therapeutic approaches. While not every client may meet the full diagnostic criteria for OCD or OCPD, many display traits that significantly impact their functioning and quality of life. These traits, such as rigid thinking, a need for control, perfectionism, and repetitive thought patterns, often intersect with the autistic experience in nuanced ways. So, if you have an autistic client or you are autistic and you experience these symptoms, you might have one of these diagnoses, but you might also just have some of the symptoms without meeting the criteria for the diagnosis. But I find that treating them with adapted OCD or OCPD approaches can still lead to meaningful improvements. I'd like to go over a couple of therapeutic approaches for these different symptoms and give you something to be able to look into and ask your therapist about to see if these are things that they might be able to incorporate into your treatment. So I'll start with the very typical one, which is that exposure and response prevention. I mentioned this in our CBT episode, which is ERP. And this is best for that classic OCD presentation, even including those who are autistic. ERP is a behavioral therapy designed to reduce those compulsions by gradually exposing clients to feared situations while preventing their typical response, such as like avoidance or rituals, and instead regulating in that moment. I like ERP. This is something that I do with myself. It is the most research-based, empirically supported treatment for OCD. I think when it's adapted with a neurodiversity affirming lens, like accounting for sensory issues, I think that it can be really effective in reducing stress from intrusive thoughts and rituals without reinforcing masking and shame. I think a really important thing to note, though, is that the rigid, confrontational style of ERP is not something I would recommend and may not suit autistic clients. And I think inherently might be more harmful than helpful. The next type is somatic therapy, which you guys have heard me talk about before. I really love somatics. So somatic experiencing or sensory motor psychotherapy, I think, are best for really like clients with a heightened mind-body disconnect or trauma history, kind of like that dissociation piece that I had mentioned in a previous episode. So somatic therapies support clients by noticing and regulating body-based sensations to manage anxiety and rigidity and compulsive urges. I think it's wonderful for learning how to sit in the body and regulate physically rather than when our head is racing. It's really hard to control what's happening in our brain, but we often have a lot more control of what's happening in our body than we realize. It's just about noticing and sitting in it. We're often really hyper aware of our brain and very disconnected from our body cues. Poor interoception is a key part of autism. And so I think somatic therapy is so important for autistic clients. And that is why I use it with my clients. So this can help by reducing compulsive symptoms, especially when there's a lot of like internal overwhelm or like chaos and racing thoughts. It can really help soothe by soothing the body first. The next piece is IFS, which is internal family systems. I really like IFS because I think it's a really cool framework. I think IFS is best for clients with really high levels of internal conflict, kind of that cognitive dissonance. You believe two things at the same time and really struggle to know which is right. There's a lot of self-criticism, that perfectionism piece. This is really good for those OCPD kind of clients who really struggle with that perfectionism and rigidity and that shame. So it's a non-pathologizing framework, which I really love, and it helps clients explore internal parts. And so we might have an anxious part and a perfectionist part. And we learn to build compassion and have good relationships with all of these parts within us. And yeah, I think it's really helpful, especially for clients who experience a lot of obsessive or controlling thoughts. I think the framework, it provides value to those parts as protective and not problematic. And we can thank the parts of us that are trying to protect us. And I think in a lot of cases, we try to push down the parts and we feel frustrated with them. And it's just taking a different approach to that. I find this framework really empowering, and I can imagine that other neurodivergent people might as well, especially those who have spent years masking and invalidating themselves. It's really about validating your inner experience. I really like IFS. I will note that adapting all of these therapies to accommodate sensory sensitivities, communication styles, processing differences, it's crucial for any type of neurodivergent individual in the treatment being effective. So the next portion of our psychoeducation is a cool theory that I want to explore, and I do want to acknowledge that there's not a ton of research for this, but this stems from a book that was recommended to me by a client. I am more than happy to frequently praise my clients for how much they share and teach me. Being able to work with the population I work with is great, and I I love my clients, so really grateful to learn in the ways that I can from them. This book is called, it's got a really long name, but if you want to look it up, it'll be in the show notes under the research. I always try to provide references that I'm using to gauge the psychoeducation portion of our segment. So if you didn't already know that, you can always look down to see the research that I am referring to. The book that I'm talking about is an OCD workbook. Now, it has some good reviews and has some bad reviews, so take that with a grain of salt, if you will. But it's called the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD. I believe that it is by John Hirschfeld. So the theory is exploring abandonment in OCD. So the theoretical perspective basically suggests that the core of OCD lies in a fear of abandonment. And so the theory is that compulsive behaviors may serve as a mechanism to prevent perceived threats of loss or rejection. While empirical evidence is limited, like I mentioned, the framework finds that it's helpful in understanding and addressing the emotional underpinnings of OCD symptoms. In therapeutic settings, exploring themes of attachment and fear of abandonment can provide insight to the individual's experience and inform treatment approaches. It is essential to approach this theory as one of many lenses through which to understand OCD. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But I have brought this up with a lot of my clients who experience these symptoms or have OCD diagnosed. And for some of them, it's been really meaningful to look at it through that lens. And so I think it's worth sharing. I think that there's a good example through contamination OCD. If we look at where it might tie back to abandonment, you might be wondering, okay, if someone has contamination OCD and they don't like things coming into their home because there might be bacteria on it. If you're walking your shoes outside, you're going to step in small traces of dirt and feces and blood. And what if those bacteria have a disease? Then you track that into the house, and now the house has that disease in it. And what if that disease is deadly, or all of our things have to be burned or destroyed, and then we can afford replacing things, so we end up sick or homeless, and in our hospital bills or in our purging of all our things, we end up with nothing. And then if we're homeless and we're at that point, we might perceive ourselves to be valueless. And if we can't hold value for the people in our lives, no one will be there for us. Now, I'm not saying that homelessness equals no value, but I am saying that it is a common belief of someone who's struggling with their sense of worth. They might struggle to feel that anyone would be there for them if they lost pieces of them that create connection and value, such as what they can give to others, or such as their status or their financial situation, etc. That's just one example, but it's kind of this pipeline of, if we keep digging and we keep digging, well, what would happen if you got blood on the house. Oh, okay, your things would get dirty. Okay, well, what happened? Well, what if there was a disease? I'm worried about this disease. Okay, well, what would happen if you got that disease? If you keep pulling the thread, that's kind of the path that is taken. Again, not one size fits all, but I do think it's a really interesting theory. And like I said, I found it to be helpful. So, as we close out our psychoeducation section, I just want to review that understanding the nuances between OCD and OCPD are important, especially when we look at noting that there is a difference between having a personality that is very wrapped around organization and perfectionism and some rigidity, in contrast to OCD, which has internal intrusive thoughts and compulsions and obsessions that create a really lack of inflexibility in their life and can take up a large amount of their day-to-day. Especially in the context of autism, it's vital for accurate diagnosis and effective intervention. Recognizing the overlapping traits and adapting therapeutic approaches to the individual's neurodivergent profile can lead to more personalized and effective care. So now we'll transition into the second segment, which is the atypical view. My atypical view, meaning my experience living with these symptoms. Now, I am not diagnosed with OCD or OCPD. I'll be clear about that. But as I said before, I am autistic, and I do have a lot of the overlap in the OCD symptoms, like many autistic individuals do. I think there's relevance in starting that a common overlap I experience is intrusive thoughts. Now, there's a difference between intrusive and impulsive thoughts, and I think people often confuse the two. So just as a note, intrusive thoughts are unwanted, distressing, and disturbing mental images or ideas that pop into our mind without warning. It can cause a lot of anxiety or discomfort, but they're typically not acted upon. In contrast, impulsive thoughts are sudden urges to act on something, like an urge to shout or make a snap decision, like dye our hair or cut our hair, often driven by emotions and lack of consideration for consequences. We see that a lot in ADHD. So it's important to understand the difference and clarify, because it helps us focus on whether we should be managing anxiety or impulse control. I see a lot of videos that are like, I let the intrusive thoughts win, and it's them just doing something like silly, like squirting someone with water or something. And I'm like, that's not an intrusive thought. So yeah, the intrusive thoughts tend to be a lot less socially appropriate. We probably wouldn't be sharing our intrusive thoughts winning on the internet, just as a good reminder. Those videos would probably be taken down. So I do struggle with intrusive thoughts, and I do a lot of visualizations, I think, to try to get myself out of it. But truthfully, I find that if my mind is distressed, the best way to resolve that is to go into my body. I have a lot more control of my body when my mind is overwhelmed. So that tends to be a helpful tool for me. But honestly, my intrusive thoughts tend to come in waves. So it's not like I'm battling them all day, every day. I tend to find that randomly I'll have a week where I have TMI, probably like a lot of like unwanted suicidal images. Like I see myself dying. I might not want to die. I might not want to die at all, but it's still really distressing to have these intrusive images shoved into your brain. And I think that they can be, it's actually one of the reasons why I don't like to watch horror films, because I think they can trigger a lot of intrusive thoughts for me. So I don't feel suicidal when these things happen all the time, but it can cause a significant amount of distress, especially if I feel too ashamed to talk to anyone about it. And when I was younger, I thought that that was a symptom of being suicidal. It just was having these intrusive thoughts, which I do think can lead to suicidality, but that wasn't always the case for me. Some symptoms that I feel like have a foot in both autism and OCD are things like I do a lot of counting and numbers in my brain. I like things to be even, and it's kind of this silent thing that I'm doing all the time. If I have things on the table, I want to make them as even as possible. Like there's two things to the left of me, I want two things to be the right of me. And that's not happening all the time, but it is a common thing. Like it's as soon as I notice it, if I notice there's an imbalance, that's when it starts to happen. But it's not like I'm finding imbalances all day long. I think that's the big distinction between me having OCD versus autism, like a really common one, which I've heard other people do this too. So it does help me feel a little bit more normal. But I like numbers on the TV for me have to be increments of 5. And the only exception for that for me is like a pure number 7. It can't be like 17 or 27. It has to just be 7. And I know that's very odd, and I have to do a lot of internal work if I'm at other people's houses and they like turn it up. But I remember being a kid, and I think my siblings would like intentionally move the number just to piss me off, and I would lose it. I remember crying to stuff like that as a child. So I have symptoms of contamination OCD. So my bed is a very common, strict, rigid zone for me. I God, I feel bad admitting this, but I really hate when people sleep in my bed or sit on my bed or just are on my bed. If people are in my room, I inherently start to get nervous that they're going to sit on my bed. I don't want to be rude. I love my friends. I love having people in my space, but at the same, I mean, I don't, but I love having people in my life. I don't actually love having people in my space, but in theory, I like having my friends over. In practice, I do get some distress sometimes. But I'll only get in my bed if I have literally just come out of the shower. It's something I've been working on, and I've improved a lot. I've been trying to take showers a little bit earlier in the day and manage how it feels to do that. It's literally like an hour before bed versus right before bed, but I'm working on it. This causes a big area of stress for me. I want my pets on the bed with me. I want to cuddle with them, but there's so much distress of like their paws are dirty and they haven't had a bath. So I will put a blanket down on my bed if I have guests coming, literally just out of fear that they'll sit there. I have a very strict inside clothes, outside clothes sort of rules, and there's different zones in the house where outside clothes are allowed, and there's not many, but typically there's a couple. I also have a similar issue with my couch. There's a singular spot on my couch that I have deemed to be my spot, and it's clean, and I will, again, put a blanket down if guests come over as well because I don't want them to sit on it in their outside clothes. I don't even like when my partner sits there, honestly. I do work on these things, and it is still very hard for me. And another thing that comes up is I've had the multi-year long pattern of double and sometimes triple checking the door before bed. We had an intruder kick down our door once when the top lock was left unlocked, and I have not really been able to fully accept that it is truly locked since then. For a while, I put chairs in front of the door, so in theory, like I could hear the chairs getting moved if someone broke in. I don't know. I moved away from that, but it was really bad for a while. I feel like there is a very long list that I could continue, but I think you get the point. I think that if I'm looking at like strategies that actually helped me, typically the strategies for me is almost always the exposure type aspect with regulation. So it's facing the scary thing. It is sitting on my bed after I've been out of the shower for an hour and maybe sat on different areas in my house. Might sound crazy to someone who doesn't struggle with OCD-like thinking. And that's fair. But it's baby steps for me of doing the scary thing, the thing that's scary, moving the chair away from the door, and reminding myself that I'm safe. Nothing's bad is happening. Everything is just as it is, even without the chairs in front of the door. And it's helpful to have someone with me. Typically, like my partner will, be like, everything's okay. We're totally safe. There's no way people can get in. The top lock is locked, blah, blah, blah. And it's helpful, but it takes a lot of regulation, and it takes sitting in the discomfort, and learning to sit in the discomfort, I would argue, is the hardest part, but also the part that helps me overcome it. I think that these traits, I recognize that they get me weird looks when I speak about them. So these are commonly issues I don't verbalize to others. Obviously, my partner sees them because he's with me, like we share a home, but this is definitely an area of intentional masking for me where it's easier to keep it to myself than explain. And I'm still working on vulnerability in this space in my life. I have never been treated for OCD symptoms, partially because I don't want to. I like having a clean bed. I don't want to change that. There there's probably a part of me that's afraid of facing a lot of that, and I imagine that others feel the same. I think this is a relevant time to turn to our third and final segment, which is our call to action. I think that today I want to start with encouraging listeners who don't have these traits to just consider having patience the next time someone is struggling with a fear you think is irrational. Unfortunately, telling them it's irrational will likely get you nowhere. And if anything, it may increase a sense of shame that they feel about themselves and their mind when they're struggling to control their thoughts and patterns or compulsions. Now, if you're navigating OCD, OCPD like traits, it's important to remember you're not alone. And healing is not a one-size-fits-all process. If your current methods of coping aren't working, don't lose hope. There's no rush. There's no need to force yourself to change. But there are various therapeutic approaches waiting for your readiness that can meet you where you're at. It may take time and experimentation, and it's not always a clear path forward. For me, it's often been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But finding the right tools to manage these patterns is possible. If you find yourself feeling trapped in rigid routines or overwhelmed by obsessive thoughts, consider stepping outside of traditional frameworks. Explore therapies that are sensory focused, trauma informed, or compassion driven, like the ones we spoke about today, like the somatic therapies, internal family systems, or exposure and response prevention. Healing does not have to look like everyone else's. Healing is your own and comes at whatever time you're ready for it to come. So I would really just encourage you to be gentle with yourself. Allow yourself to breathe and take a moment to notice where you feel tension in your body. Simply sit in it, even if just for a moment. Healing happens in moments of stillness quite often, and it's 100% okay to move at your own pace. You deserve compassion when approaching your own experience. And I wish you luck on your healing journey. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, feel free to share it, subscribe, leave a comment or a review, or send it to someone who might benefit from the psychoeducation, or just need a little reminder that they are not alone. If you are interested in my coaching or therapy services, you can reach out to me directly and connect with me at theatypicalview.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and I hope we can stay connected.